Good evening, everyone. This is a special meeting and financial workshop for the Downers Grove Grade School District 58 Board of Education here on Monday, December 7th, 2020 at 7:01 p.m. at Longfellow Center. This meeting is also being live streamed for the public on District 58's YouTube channel. Alyssa, will you please call roll?
Member Doshi.
Here.
Member Hannis.
Here.
Member Harris.
Here.
Member Olchik.
Here.
Member Samanti is absent. Member Weiner.
Here.
And Member Hughes.
Here. This evening, members of the public who are viewing remotely may provide a public comment by calling 630-743-4085 and recording their comment. Comments will be accepted until we reach the public comment portion of the agenda. We will play all comments submitted remotely in the order in which they were received. I have allotted 30 minutes for public comment. As always, let's start off with the flag salute.
There it is.
I pledge
allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right, let's just kick it straight off with Todd Dreyfall on our financial workshop presentation.
Thank you. Now that I've started my presentation, let me share it. There we go. This evening is our annual financial planning and projection workshop. Each year at November, December, the board receives an update on financial planning. Previously in other years, it has often been sometimes in November and talks about the tax levy. We are moving the calendar ahead a bit, and we are starting to talk about fiscal year 22. This presentation is in some ways 4 presentations and rolled up into one with some fairly heavy topic formats. One is the first to talk about an initial projection and the next steps in that process. Also to introduce a new model, a financial plan, a structure that the board would formalize a process that the district now uses in the process to evaluate as it works through to develop the budget early in this year. The other piece is to talk about the short and long-term capital planning of the district. This is a continuation and a movement or a different structure than the district had previously been on back in February, and then how we've adjusted for this current economic structure that we're dealing with. The last piece is also a fund balance policy review, and again, leading on and following some of the work that had been done back in February. Thank you. As with any presentation for finances, we always start out with the district mission and the district goals. That is our foundation, our bedrock. It's what we always look towards when we start to develop a budget process. And in any financial projection or planning, that is the first piece that we always talk about. Certainly, the district strategic plan that it's had for the last several years, and we always look to goal 3, which is providing a safe and effective learning environment in a fiscal responsible way. Next piece is we want to talk about kind of as I explained a little bit, the structure of the presentation is initially the financial plan and goals process, the forecast and projection, an updated forecast looking at some of these aspects of capital and fund balance, reviewing the capital planning process, planning that we're thinking of and the fund balance policy, as well as then the operational planning process going forward in 22 to 26, and then the next steps with a calendar and approval process. This is the first step, and it's a very high level look at where we're at. As we go through the next few months, it becomes in much more detail and much more substantial in structure for the board to look at. We have certain graphs and so forth that becomes more detailed later down the road. With the help of, I'm going to say the FAC, the Financial Advisory Committee, they went through this on Friday morning and had some suggestions. We tried to take those into account. One of the things that we added into this, and although the board is probably fairly familiar with the budget and the level, we think it's always good to remind the community and everyone that the budget for the district of 13 buildings, 5,000 students, 600 plus staff members is about almost $73 million this year in expenditures. So it's not a small amount of money that we are looking at, and it's substantial and structured and detailed in complexity. So looking at financial plans and goals, back up a step, sorry. The district has a process that the administration goes through, and the financial projection that the board sees each year is a modeling system. This is the next to take it to another level where the administration brings to the board a financial plan that the board would then approve in March. The budget then would be based on that plan. The benefit of this process is that the budget going forward for fiscal year 22 is grounded in a system that looks to maintain and looks at least 3 fiscal years, so that when the district is talking about adding or changing or evaluating changes of programs, does it fit into the plan? How does that work? Can we fund it? We don't, certainly one of the things, don't want to start something that we can't continue for a long period of time. As I said, this is a formalization process of something that we already do. This is something certainly when the district administration works through a budget on an annual basis, it's looking at many of these pieces. This is more of a formal structure, a little more transparency, because you build into the plan curriculum curriculum schedules and updates, technology updates, and then addressing the capital items and those things that are needed as well as staffing structures. So a financial plan is something that is to ensure adequate funding of programs. How it works is during the winter months of, through December through March, the board reviews and then adopts the plan. It as I said, board looks at those curriculum updates and those technology replaces as part of that plan and helps address some of those items that we have continually talked about. How do we fit those in? How do we make those all work? The goal of the plan is to present a balanced budget on an annual basis. And when we talk about a balanced budget, it isn't enough anymore for revenue to simply equal expenditures. The district financing system and funding format is that we receive 42 to 45% of our annual revenue in the last 20 to 35 days of the fiscal year. That means, and we have an expenditure that's pretty consistent throughout the entire fiscal year. That means that there's a low cash point before that revenue comes in, and we need to maintain that level. We'll talk about that a little bit more. But that is a piece that we need to ensure that we have funding for. It also means we need to grow the district's fund balances to stave off short-term borrowing for those purposes, as well as to save for classroom and capital long-term needs. Some of the expected outcomes is to ensure the long-term funding of programs in a multi-year projection. So looking at, this is what we would look at normally this time of year, is the initial forecast and projection for the next fiscal year, and then look at what it looks like over a 5-year. We always, before we show a graph, remind everyone that the 4th and 5th year with state funding, even in a non-COVID economic, because I don't think there's any normal year, but any non-COVID issue can always adjust a bit in those 4th and 5th years, and we never for surely know. But this year, particularly so, those 4th and 5th years can do weird things. So we don't necessarily concentrate on those, but looking at the next 3 fiscal years. So in our assumption system, the really positive piece is that the downtown TIF in Downers Grove is expiring. And that comes onto the tax rolls for the first time in the 2021 tax levy. So the levy that the board will adopt next November will have that, that as part of it. That's looking at about a $95 million increase in new property coming onto that for the first time. We don't know what the consumer price index is a piece that helps drive that revenue because of the tax cap structure. We assume a 1%. We won't know what that CPI number will be until mid to late January for the end of December. Going out, we have a 1.7% adjustment onto that. We level out state funding. There are many conversations about, is state funding going to drop? Is it going to increase? What's it going to look like? We go with what, just keeping it at a consistent level and adjust as we have information to justify a change. We don't assume any additional funds at this point in time from the state and federal government for COVID impact. We did receive CARES money early on, unable to receive those, use those, but we are not, we don't assume or project that we would get more. Obviously, if we do, it would be a wonderful addition, but at this point, since we budget on a conservative basis, unless we know and have some certainty of revenue coming, we are not going to presume that that money is going to be available to us. The other impacts are a slower return of interest income. That is something that we've talked to the board over the several months ago, those last couple of months, about the impact when we when we submitted the FY21 budget, and that had an impact there. It will have an impact in 22, and depending on what the economics are, could be slow to come back to the district in 23. That is about $150,000 hit on revenue on an annual basis from what it was last year. On the expense side, we have made some adjustments. We have not included the OKeep program in the 22 budget at this time. OKeep is structured as a budget neutral program. That means, and we've had questions each year from parents as to how come it costs so much. When we have to double staff for kindergarten for that program, that entire cost of the program is borne by the tuition charge for that program. At this time, as we are looking through and projecting and planning and building a budget, because we cannot today institute that program, it would not make sense. It wouldn't be prudent to have a staffing structure in place to do that without having a revenue offset. You understand it's 12 to 14 staff positions. when you add salary and benefits into that, that's a considerable amount of spend without that offset income to the district, and a big portion of the current year's deficit. Also, current staffing levels are maintained. Salary increases past contracts in the projection, because this projection does go past all three of the bargaining unit contracts, are based on the annual increases in those contracts currently. We build in a CPI addition to purchase services and supply budgets for supply and materials. And we have an average of a 5% increase on health insurance, a 3% increase on transportation. So looking at these two pieces, the top line is the ending fund balance line. And you can see when we look at the projected 22 through 26, it seems pretty steady in 22, 23, and 24, but then starts to take a dip in 25 and 26. That's why we always talk about those last 2 years are a little, can do different things, and you have the compounding effect of expenditures that can have an impact on it. And remember that state income is at a flat number, so that has some impact as well. But the concerning piece to look at this in this initial projection is that low cash point. Our low cash point is right at the end of May, first part of June. There's about a week or so that we come in where we haven't necessarily received all of the, started to receive early tax money in yet from the early property taxes. And that's when the district gets into its low cash point, right before that first week of June. And understand the first week of June is usually when we have one of our largest payrolls, because at that point we're paying out end of the year stipends, some additional, any other extra work that's been happening through that summer semester. That spring semester. And so that is usually one of our largest payroll pieces of the year, and that has an impact. So those are taken into account to give you an estimate of what that low cash point. When you see it go negative, that has some issues. Now, for 21, we think we're in a good position right now with our spend, the way everything is working. We've talked to the board over the last 4 or 5 months about that, as we've talked about budget development, and we continually watch our cash flow as we get into that spring to whether we are going to need to borrow or where we're at with that. Right now, I think we're in a good place. But you can see how that line precipitously goes down into a negative position where we would not have funds to cover our expenses at that point. Now, that's the initial piece. Certainly, this is before we have gone through, administration has started to look in detail at positions, programs, what contract services need to be. And that is a process that happens now into January and February as we work through the next step. We wanted to start to update and talk about some of these next pieces with addressing the fund balance issue, that negative line, as well as some capital and other pieces. So one of the things that we do with the financial plan that spells out and puts it into detail and gives some transparency is it builds in a schedule into that plan for curriculum updates, technology update and replacement schedules, and addresses and works at to note the capital items that the district has. Currently, the district does budget of almost $400,000 a year for curriculum updates. You see on there the list of some of the items coming up. Many of the larger expensive pieces have been done the last couple of years. English language arts, I think Justin said was over close to $1 million. We paid for that piece over several years. Science and math are also expensive items, and we have them budgeted over a couple of years. We have in the next couple of years some of the non-core, which are not such a substantial replacement cost. But those are the type of pieces we put in the schedule and line out. Technology updates and replacements. This is an area that we have funded as we are able to and continually put things together. We've worked leases. One of the things we did accelerate as far as this summer and the spring was replacement of staff laptops, because those were getting to 5 and 6 years old. And what we found in April and May was staff were having problems using certain things to connect and work with students. So we accelerated that replacement cycle this summer, so that in the event we ended up like as we were with remote, that staff will be able to support and work with an updated equipment. We want to make sure that those are in a replacement cycle and are budgeted and planned for on an annual basis. The board is obviously familiar with the master's facility process that the district has been working on, understanding that that is over $200 million. Not that that is something that would be done or function or adjusted for in the immediate term, but it is a list of items that we know that need some addressing, and to help start working on that and documenting that on an annual basis and prioritizing that and working through that as a process, part as a financial plan piece, but also as a separate conscious piece that we're continually working at and building some level of fund balance for and other opportunities for financing. We have an example, just a short example of some of the technology refresh that we're looking at for the next couple of years, with switch server replacements, storage replacements, and then user items as iPads and Chromebooks need replacement. So when we take that initial projection and we just place that technology projection onto that and increase the expenditure by just those small amounts for technology of a couple $100,000 a year, you can see what happens to both the end balance without making an adjustment, what happens to those ending year fund balances, but also what happens to that low cash point. And that line goes down at a greater degree than that end fund balance piece. Which gets us to the conversation that the district started back almost a year ago now. The Financial Advisory Committee started talking about this, I think, after the last audit in January and February. I know that because I went and looked up the memo date, and I think it was updated as of March 2020, of developing a fund balance policy to ensure that the district has funds on hand to cover those expenses, regardless of, when there's a shortage or problems in revenue, those type of things that can happen and has happened in the past. Through discussion and evaluation of our expenditure schedule and payment and our revenue stream, as we said, 42 to 45% comes in the last month. It's a determination about the fund balance at end of the year needs to be about 35% of the budgeted expenditures for that fiscal year. So that as we develop a plan or a budget, the ending fund balance needs to be at 35% of whatever the budgeted expenditures are. Now that has an impact on expenses, it has an impact on what revenue is available to help offset. But that's an important piece as we measure and go forward. It also means that fund balance grows over time as expenses grow. That is sometimes a misnomer for a lot of people who look at fund balance at the end of the year and say, you have so much money. Why do you need this, or why can't you do this? And the reality is that's not the money we have in the bank on May 15th or May 30th. And that's the reason why. So being a finance projection, I think it's obligations to put in a table, at least one. This has the beginning balance revenue and expenditure back to 2019 and then projected out to 2026. But this, this piece does a couple things. One, it reduces expenditures by about $1.1 million. It also then takes into account those technology updates that were noted in the table a couple slides back. And then it addresses the other thing in the fund balance policy, and that is the district has in the operations fund a sinking fund of about $800,000. That has been separated from operating revenue, operating funds to be used for capital items. However, because of what we've just gone through and talked about and shown you the line, we don't have that money. We could not use that today for a capital item because we would need that money to cover our bills. So in part of this development of this long-term process and this financial plan would be, and this is something we initially started talking about with the FAC back in February, and then I think with the board, there was an update to the board at the February 2020 board meeting of starting to move that money, $200,000 a year per year for the next 4 years from the operation and maintenance fund to the capital fund. So that would be freed up in order to use that when necessary. You know, one of the issues we've talked about in recent, we've made the board aware, is that we need to do a new roof at Pierce Downer. It's $1.5 million. Other roofs will come due. Other roofs may not need that extensive work. Right now, today, we could not take $300,000 out of our capital funds to put a new membrane on a roof to give it another 12 years. That's just not something we have availability for at this point. In this process, that would help us, help the district have that capacity over the term. So I want to switch gears a second to the capital planning piece, or as I call it, capital planning 2.0. Following up on the work that has been going on for the last 24 months in the district for development of master's facilities plan. As we headed into 2020, the district had developed a draft master's facility plan that was actually, I think, presented to the board in July or August of 2019. After a committee of staff members, parents, stakeholders in the community evaluated, walked through buildings, worked with the architect, had a lengthy process to develop a priority structure to come up with that draft master's facility plan. The second task force started working at that point on the process, and the district was in the place to put out a questionnaire to the community to see what they would support and what their thoughts were of this when we have put those things on hold. We knew at that time that we certainly would not be looking at and let me be clear, the only funding source at that level is a bond referendum for capital borrowing. We knew that process would not have enough that would equal out all of that work. And we knew that master facility plan was a could be even decade document that would take years to come to fruition and would change over time. The next steps in that process would have been to look at the district's debt service extension base. The district has capacity to borrow and have a tax levy to support that outside of operating funds. It is limited on an annual basis by, it's about $1.5 million a year. It grows by, again, consumer price index each year, and the capacity grows. The district's debt service extension base is utilized currently at its capacity, but has some structure. We can talk about that in a minute. So that was the initial plan in 2019. Now we go to where we're at on that. We've put on hold that bond referendum piece as we work through our current economic situation. That has some look at and review of what are some other opportunities for us to utilize at this point. We can restructure the current debt on that debt service extension base, extend it out a bit, and utilize that for borrowing for this summer's capital work on the roof at Pierce Downer, as well as some other pieces that we can talk about in a second. The next step is we have, the board has talked about at length about this facility. This facility could come up as a possible thing, and that would have some opportunities for future. And then at that point, hopefully, we're in a position that we can return to where we stopped in March of 2020 with the continuation and work through the master's facility plan process with a question if at that point the community would support such a thing. So looking at a short list of some of the things that would be done for this summer is, as we talked about, the Pierce Downer roof, some equipment replacements. Parking lots are in many areas are in dire need of work, as well as looking at and utilizing whatever grant opportunities are out there for lighting upgrades, things that have some short-term return on investment. Lighting upgrades to LED from fluorescence can have a return on investment of 2 to 3 years, where the operating reductions in expenditures have paid for, in just simple 2 years can pay for some of those updates. And that would allow us to lower our bills of lighting replacements and electricity and be able to have some other funds for other pieces. There are grants available for those type of things. There's an abatement and a new tiling, a floor tiling at Puffer and O'Neill. Part of that plan is being paid for by a maintenance grant that the district received from the state of $50,000, which are also some other, there are other opportunities out there like that maintenance grant. But to be clear, they're never at the level of our need, and they're never at the level of what borrowing would do for us to help cover those pieces. That would be summer of 21, summer of 22, fiscal year 2023, and summer of 22 work. There would be the possibility of some $2 additional million of work to be done, with a priority of that at that point, where we would be talking to the board November of 21, or even earlier, about what those next projects would be based on evaluation of the district. And then going forward with a referendum piece. So that would allow us, so the next steps would be to restructure the current debt. Initially, we had discussed with the board, certainly with the FAC, the idea that we would try to look at a way of saving as much as we could and using operating funds to pay for those, to go out and issue debt and then and pledge operating funds out of that piece. The problem is that reduces what's available for operating considerably. And there's an opportunity here with the low interest rate environment that exists in the market today for us to restructure our current debt load. It does extend the debt a little bit, but it is advantageous for us because it does not commit our operating dollars for that period of time when we have a need for them, and we've seen what those charts are doing and so forth. This is an example of what that debt structure looks like. Currently, the blue line is our debt structure. The yellow line across is our debt service extension base. That is our cap. And you can see that the blue bars are above that a bit. Our capacity is, our bonding debt is a little above that. So we're paying out more than what we can actually levy. What we would do is as that capacity opens up, we would then push those levies back out into 25 and 26. By restructuring this, we would take care of those and level out the debt payments out through 28 at the current level. And you see there's a little portion of 29 left. So it does extend it out a couple of years, but it does do two things. It levels out our current debt structure and allows us to have that capacity to do that work this summer that we need to do. I think I'll take a minute just before I move on to the next step. I was going to go through this without questions, but because we've gone through a fair amount, is there any questions on that, on the capital borrowing piece before we go back into the operations, finance planning, and the next steps?
I have just two really quick technical questions. So if you're looking at the last slide, if we did nothing to our non-referendum debt, under the current structure, just so I understand the process, we would pay off those bonds we sold for Lester and those other projects a few years ago in 2020 by 2026, and we would have about, and we'd have $1.5 million in DSEB at that point. Is that correct?
It'll be a little better than that because it grows at whatever.
But it'll grow by CPI,
right.
yes.
Yeah, but yes, correct.
Okay.
Correct. And we would take, I believe there is a level, as you can see, those blue tables, the blue bars are above that line in 20, 21, 22. So we owe that money, we pay that money out. It is a cash flow position piece. And the district is able to recoup those payments when that extension, when that base increases or when there's capacity. So in 2026, even in 24, 25, there is capacity between that blue bar and that yellow line that the board could adopt a resolution and place back to get to pay back itself some of those funds that have been paid out. So there's that as well. Other questions on?
Just to also understand how this works technically, is our tax base, obviously our tax base is funding this 1.5 million extension. Are they funding that on an annual basis, or is this 1.5 million over, call it 9 years?
No, it's $1.5 million per year on the tax levy. That is the bonded debt. It is not something you approve, the board approves each year on the levy. It is done by resolution, and it is set until the board changes that, passes a new resolution changing it. We work with our bond counsel, Chapman Cutler, And they work through these pieces and help us and put all of that together for all of that when it's, as we do it. And if the board did approve a supplemental levy last year that helped adjust, because there were a couple of years of increases that had not been adjusted, to help start to reclaim some of that the debt structure. Okay.
So, I guess, I'm sorry if I'm a little slow on the uptake on this one, but still going back to the plan for restructuring the debt. Big picture, I mean, I see the benefits, right? Big picture, it helps our taxpayers. We're going to be restructuring under lower interest rates, so that's a benefit for everybody. But it doesn't do anything for our operating budget. So, like, if you were going to kind of simplify like your rationale for wanting to do this, how would you sum that up for me?
So before us, we have a few options to essentially pay for the roof and some of the other items. Go back to this list. To cover this work for the summer of 21, there are several options available. One is we would have to figure out how to pay cash. Yeah. Which would be to lower whatever we could to find that kind of cash to cover those costs. Two, we could issue a bond out of operating
Working cash.
without going into the DSEB that would not adjust the debt service, but would also then take, say we want to pay for it over 10 years, $150,000, $170,000 a year out of our operating funds each year to help cover that debt to do that work. The third piece would be to do the restructuring piece. That would, to do that. So those are the two options are
Sure.
borrowing.
So
one is paying is trying to figure out how to pay cash.
again, I'm sorry if I'm slow on this one. So how does that help us pay for that? How does restructuring the debt now? I mean, it's not like it's not like a cash out refi because we don't have any more. We don't have our debt. We pretty much maxed out our debt service extension base. So
We're borrowing against the future selves in 2027, 28, 29. By borrowing against that
we're
future
just
self,
extending it
we
out.
pay for it now.
okay.
Let me say, there's one other option. Oops, I'm going backwards. There's one other option that we could, on the borrowing side, and that is not restructure, borrow the money, and not pay it back until we have capacity in our DSEB, which would be in 29 and 30 and 31. And as anyone, if you think about in finance, if you are borrowing and not making a payment for that many years, there's an interest charge to that piece that has an implication.
Sure.
Which would not be my suggested option, usually, rarely, ever, just because of that structure. So, any way we can do it. The first couple ways is taking out of operations in some capacity,
right?
Whether it's over X amount, a small amount each year of $100,000, or all of it next year, or restructuring. And because the interest rate environment is still in a good position, it makes some sense to do that.
Todd, I think maybe this will clarify it. The orange bars that are on there that are representing what the debt would look like then include additional borrowing already to do the roofs.
Right. That is restructuring the current debt.
Does that help?
And
does,
adding
yeah.
on that 3 additional, and maybe I didn't, you're right, thank you, I'm sorry.
That's what I don't
may
think
not have made clear.
clarified.
This is restructuring the current debt structure, those blue lines, as well as adding an additional $3 million some odd dollars.
That's why they hit the D-sub line. Because if we just restructured it, we'd have a gap
Yep.
in every
Right,
year.
yeah, correct.
Okay.
Okay.
I think one of the other biggest challenges that you see here is our capital needs are far greater than what we could pay out of our operating funds.
Yeah.
And, you know, while we're in this kind of standstill between now and a potential referendum, roofs need to be fixed, boilers need to be replaced, pipes need to be addressed, parking lots need to be, you know, funded and fixed. And so that to me is the advantage of restructuring your debt. You do save money on interest. District 58 has a unique situation where they're currently above the DSEB, which typically doesn't happen. Todd has explained that in the past. That happened several years ago. It does allow us, again, to flatten out our current DSEB structure, but also get access to funds so we can fix some of these immediate capital needs, which we would not be able to do through traditional operating funds.
Mm-hmm.
Or if we had to do that, then what you would see is, in my view, drastic cuts to some of the other operating funds, i.e. the ed fund, because you'd have to take that money out in order to do that, which you would see a loss in programs then.
One more quick technical question, Todd. When you compare us to other districts in the area and in the county, in the greater Chicagoland area, this $1.5 million DSEP, that's got to be among the lowest. Is that correct?
Yes. It is. So the DSEP is established way back, essentially when the tax cap came in. Whatever non-referendum debt a local unit of government had was what its capacity was, and then it allowed to grow by inflation. Many districts had different formats and structures of having issued working cash bonds or health and life safety bonds. Fires, you know, those type of, you know, those are non-referendum required bonding capacity before tax caps came in, and they are still a tool that are used in counties throughout the state that don't have tax caps, because not everyone has a tax cap. So that is how that is established. This is Downers Grove has a remarkably very low capacity. The district I previously worked in is essentially over $5.5 million a year. And I think last year they borrowed over $30 million to do significant retrofits to one of their oldest schools. So, you know, that's a large high school district, but still $1.5 million is a considerably low piece. There is a possibility, there is a referendum question that can be asked of the community to increase that capacity. That is also something that could be looked at and entertained. It's a nuanced question, so it's takes some explanation to people as to what they're actually approving, as opposed to some, you know, the standard referendum.
And therein lies a huge irony. And
Right.
when people are trying to compare us to other districts, we are in trouble now, and it's going to be very difficult for us to get out of the trouble we're in now, because 25 years ago, we were so careful with our money. We didn't have a lot of debt. It's almost like we were punished back in the 90s for not having a lot of debt. And so we're hamstrung now by not being able to help borrow funds to replace roads, boilers, parking lots, things
You're
like that, which
limited
every other
now.
district can do almost, but we can't.
You're limited now by the great fiscal responsibilities done 2.5 decades ago.
Greg, irony is you know, a perfect call here, because that's exactly what it is. So in essence, the districts that had a great deal of debt in the early 90s when the PTEL legislation came on board continue to be rewarded year after year in terms of flexibility and spending.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what I would say is that the taxpayers in District 58, that's
they
one of
should
the
be
reasons
thanking
why our taxes are so low
Yep.
here in Downers Grove, is because, you know, way back when in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and even continuing today, we've enjoyed one of the lowest tax bases because of those good fiscal decisions. The problem with that type of a structure is, and again, I shouldn't necessarily use the word problem. It's a nice thing to have, but when things start to break and when you have to replace those, your next available option is really a bigger referendum, and it makes it more challenging to pass and to go through the community like that, especially when you have 13 aging facilities, which we have right now.
Yep.
Okay. I'm going to move on to coming back to that initial projection and those earlier tables of where the district's at. on a financial basis and looking out the next couple of years. The district has, again, because, you know, as we've talked about, some limited fund balances, and there are always more needs than resources available, and that helps prioritization. In going through what is the next steps, we look at what we can do and how we're going to function, and a process that we need to engage in over the next year or more years, evaluating how we're going to make some of those next steps, because we do foresee, you know, smaller CPIs for a period of time. That is our only growth structure, and given, I think, everyone's understanding of the condition of the state, and not a substantial increase. I mean, 80% of our funding comes from local property taxes as it is. We may see an additional some money down the road from the federal government, but federal government money is geared towards specific needs and purposes, and has limitations on how it's used. So looking at what we can do to get that line back into a positive position, that bottom low cash where we have funds on hand to cover our expenses on our lowest cash days. This plan, this projection line reduces expenditures by $1 million from that initial projection in fiscal year 22. And then you can see what happens as that piece goes forward and goes on through, where it keeps that fund balance piece above that line. Still may need to go up a little bit more. We need to look at revenue and other options into that piece, but that is you know, a piece that we need to look at. So that's what a line looks like that we need to work towards, and where we need to be when we adopt the plan, we recommend and ask for board approval of a financial plan in March. And we kind of talk about, you know, projected revenues, and this is kind of fiscal year 22 with some of those targets in place, with those technology ads, that sinking fund piece, reduction of $1 million in expenses, and what that would look like coming in. There are options that we can look at, certainly on the fee side there, you know, for the next, because this is looking at fiscal year 22, but then looking at multiple years out and making sure that plan, that line stays that way. There's always the ability of looking at some other increased fees. There is the potential of looking at an operating fund piece as a referendum. Not selling referendums tonight, but I'm responsible for giving you and letting you know all the options that are out there. There's a piece that we need to talk about on the expense side, and where we're at with how do we look at long-term some of the operational structure of the district, and what are ways that we can utilize facilities, utilize our resources in a different manner that allow for some efficiencies in places, and, you know, and effectiveness in class sizes, and some uniformity in a way so there's consistency. That has, you know, some potential abilities of being able to maintain programming on a multi-year basis, because that's always our goal, is to make sure that the students coming through every year have consistent, you know, programming and structure. You know, we certainly need to, at this point, the district uses a demographer that does enrollment projections, and that would be the next step to update those. They haven't been updated in several years, and to start that process, and to start looking at enrollment trends over the next 10 years, both on a district level, but also in a neighborhood level, and by attendance center, and looking at where that's at. So wrapping this up, and so we can go to some questions and discussion as to the next steps. The plan is, and because we've gone through a lot of heavy stuff, is a new idea, a new structure, fund balance practice and policy in place, updates for capital and borrowing and so forth. The next pieces would be that this is an initial presentation of all of this, that the administration would go back and start to work on the next 22 expenditures and to start incorporating all of the things that we've just talked about into this plan process with that fund balance piece in place, looking at those technology updates in that refresh cycle, incorporating capital planning piece, which is, we've talked as a separate item, but if it's not separate, then it becomes part of that operating. If we're not going, if it's not something to go out and do and borrow, then it has to, because we do have those needs, we do have to deal with those, specifically we look at the roof as an example, but we do have those items that we need to start to address. And those have impact on operations. And then to start initiating that borrowing process, and working through our plan, time schedule, and to start developing a plan, starting in March with a task force of what 23 starts to look like and what are options and operating and things, some opportunities to bring back to the board into the summer and fall of 21. So the last slide is the timetable, is a calendar of how this would look. This is the initial plan. In January, there would be an update. In February, we call a final draft, but a draft of the financial plan presented to the board for review with a March approval time. March is the time frame because it has to happen because of staffing structure requirements under state law for certified staff, and certainly want to have that that locked in. Not that you can't change and add later. We talk about O'Keefe as an example, but not, if resources are available and things change, because what we know in February and March today can change and opportunities can open up later on. And they can be weighed against the plan to determine if they fit into the plan and we're able to do them and, and move forward with them. O'Keefe would be that example. That we could put that in place. And then starting with that task force review in March and having that conversation and going through that process. And then you have obviously the standard schedule of where we approve the budget. You have a tentative budget display and then final approval by the end of September for the fiscal year 22 budget, based on the financial plan that would be approved in March. With that, are there questions?
First of all, Todd, thank you so much. I know a lot of being on the FAC, Steve and I know the incredible amount of effort that went into this work. I did just want to, as we're opening up for questions, I wanted to say something real quick, and that is, I think this is great timing, instituting the idea of doing a 5-year lookout. I think that it gives all of us board members, and especially, I think back to my first year on the board, when you're being asked to approve something, a new position that has never existed before, and you look at the budget and it fits in there and it all looks pretty, you're excited to do something, but you don't always get a good vision of what that impact is as you look out. So I know that year 4 and year 5 are not necessarily as accurate. I can't count on that 100%, but at least still gives me a vision into the future. So for anybody tuned in today or who watches this later on YouTube, this is a new way for us to look at it. And I think that's the big part of what we're seeing here today is this, even though we talk about it sometimes, this is how it's going to affect something multi-year out. That's a game changer, I think, for me. I remember Greg and I having a conversation after one of our first board meetings, sitting on the board together. And we were talking about budget stuff, and we were so excited to be making some changes and doing some stuff, but I look back at it now and goes, did any of that stuff impact stuff that we're doing today? And this would help with that. So I appreciate that. So I'm looking forward to, we've talked a lot in FAC, so I'm looking forward to what the full board has to say.
Yeah, and I guess I'll share my perspective. I've seen this kind of come together over the last couple of weeks and listen to other people's perspective as kind of how the information is being presented. And I'm constantly trying to think, how can we simplify the message even further? And so I'll kind of boil it down to the lowest level that I can, with my understanding is, like you said, it's 4 presentations. We're trying to, shove 10 pounds in the 5 pound bag here. But I think, first of all, we got a negative trend line with the low cash points. If we add stuff that we know we have to do, like curriculum updates, tech updates, some capital, not much, but some capital, it becomes even more negative. And then coupled with the fact that we need to be saving in some fashion, we haven't been doing any of that. So the reality is we need to cut $1.1 million, and that's not going to be easy. So I think we've kind of pointed that out a few times. I just want to reinforce that for next year, we have to make that 1.0 cut. It's not and one of the things that kind of comes up in listening to these conversations, I think as a board, typically we're presented options and we make a decision. From my perspective, this isn't an option. It's just something that we need to do. So, we're going to have a recommendation from the administration in February as to what those cuts are going to be. That's the reality.
Thanks, Steve. I really liked your synopsis there. You talked about the message. In my notes, I wrote the narrative, and my ask, again, I don't need an answer right now, but my ask for the administration is how are we going to get this out there to the community? I'm going to guess, and I'll check with Darren later, that if we look at our analytics about this meeting, it's not going to be quite as popular as some of our more recent board meetings, but we
single digits.
Sure. But we absolutely need to get the entire community and the single digit, they're probably Justin and James and people who Kevin says they have to be here. We need to really engage the community on this. This is as serious a challenge that the district is going to be facing as the COVID crisis. And you can make the argument one's more serious or the other, but this is when COVID is in the rear of a mirror, we're still going to be facing this. And Steve, you just said we need to make some hard decisions and we need to make them soon. And we need to get ahead of that. We need to have that engagement level with the community. When we're saying we need to make a 7-figure cut to the next budget, that's not going to be well received, but at least if we get the message or the narrative out there now, we'll get some more understanding. Within 100 yards of us in every direction, there are people who are not going to want Longfellow to be sold. But we need to be able to change some minds on that one and get some buy-in on that. There's gonna be people who see a referendum and say their taxes are gonna go up, but we just need to get that message out there in the community where right now, and rightfully so, Facebook is buzzing over COVID. And I get that. That makes complete sense. But as if I'm being optimistic, as we move away from this crisis and we got a vaccine coming soon, we need to shift focus pretty quickly of the entire community and get them thinking about this, because this is not a problem that the 10 of us in this room can address on our own. We really need a lot of people to support us and to be engaged and to listen and to help us come up with ideas and give us feedback and not necessarily buy in to some of the decisions that we're gonna have to make, but at least understand them. That's my comment. I do have a question. I was just to throw the icing on the cake there. Todd, how confident are you in flat state funding? And maybe that's not the right question. Maybe the right question would be, if the governor was going to slash evidence-based funding on the heels of the progressive income tax amendment failing, how would that affect your projections? I mean, again, it's hard to say, but are we talking about $100,000 a year, more, less?
The one thing I'll say is that the one positive I've seen so far currently is that we get our payments timely, which is extraordinarily important for us right now. How confident am I that it'll be flat? I can't even guess at this point. I mean, that seems to be the safest route because we run projections in this manner. For revenue, if we have some certainty of items, we put it in there. Obviously, we know an idea what the new property level might be. We're conservative on those pieces. The CPI we use averages, and we're even there adjusting that down a little bit given certain format. Though, understand if there's a low CPI one year and things bounce back, that CPI comes the following year. So on the trend line, it averages out. It's just those years that one year to the next. On state funding pieces, if there is a reduction in the evidence-based funding model, the district could take a significant hit of its $3.3 million that it receives in state funding. And that is a concern that we will have to have and watch and maintain and monitor.
So again, impossible to predict. I appreciate that, but like, are we talking like six figures potentially if there is a cut to EBF?
So I think this is something we talk a lot about at the Superintendent's Association as well. I think what the conventional wisdom is right now, and again, there's no way for a crystal ball, is a hold harmless provision next school year where we stay flat for at least one more year. I'm more confident in that than I am any kind of federal bailout at this particular point where we may see money in schools. The reason why I'm more confident in a flat funding scenario is even if there's a bailout from Washington, it might get distributed on a needs basis, which would not put us anywhere near the front of the pack.
Right.
Long term, though, I think we do really have to continue to look at our state funding, where it's coming from. You may not necessarily see huge reductions, but you can see proration return. I mean, there are all sorts of things that I think we really have to consider. So right now, when we talk in the superintendent circles and Todd talks in the business official circles, we are looking at a flat funding, but know that could change. And if it does, we have to adjust those numbers down. I certainly don't think we're anticipating any kind of an increase from the state. The one thing I would like to point out to the board is when the whatever the tax you want to call it, the fair tax, the progressive tax, whatever the names are, Governor Pritzker did make a point when he went out there. The very first thing he talked about, and the only thing he talked about at that press conference, was cutting education. And I think that was very deliberate. And so I think we have to be very conscious of that. And the other thing with the evidence-based funding model that we're now under is there is a mechanism where in order to fully fund tier 1 and tier 2 schools, you take the tier 3 and tier 4 money from them. And so you could be looking at almost a double whammy there. So again, every circle that we're in right now is predicting flat funding for next school year. And no one's holding out any hope for a bailout from Washington, D.C. at this particular point for many reasons. So that's where we're at right now. But I can guarantee you we're going to continue to advocate for that in Springfield. And we'll have to wait and see where that comes in.
Yeah, you said double whammy, and the third whammy being if the governor pulls, let's say, $1 billion out of EBF in the next fiscal year, and then in the ensuing fiscal year puts that back in, it's all going to go to tier 1 and tier 2 schools. And we'll
Correct.
lose,
and if they don't amend the language in the evidence-based funding formula, remember there's a certain dollar amount that has to be kicked in every year. And if the state chooses not to kick in that point, but to keep the legislation the same, the way they get that new money for tier 1 and tier 2 is they take from tier 3 and tier 4 in almost a Robin Hood type of a scenario. Greg, to your point with the narrative, one of the things that we're reminded of in FAC, and it's something we spoke a lot at the task force, and I'm not saying this to be hokey, I really do believe this. The biggest investment we have in the community of District 58 is our schools. It's what makes our community what it is, that and a very strong village. So when you have a very strong village and a very strong school district, it causes the home values to continue to stay high. And so when we talk about a narrative around these projects in our schools, instead of really focusing on this is something we have to pay for, we need to continue to emphasize this is something you're investing in for your community. because it will pay dividends, not only in your property tax value, although that's important, or your property value, excuse me, it's the investment we're making in our kids, right? And so that is something I think we need to continue to drive with our narrative and the language, is the investment opportunity we have here. And it will make all the difference.
Right.
And our community has always supported our schools. We have to continue to show them the need and what we're doing with that. And that's really where I like where Todd's coming from with this 5-year plan. This is a very transparent way to show our community this is exactly where everything is. This is exactly what our intentions are, and it just makes it a very user-friendly type of a system.
Yeah, and Kevin, I view your ability to build a narrative and share that highly, as I do the rest of the team to be able to do the same. I guess I'm just eventually I want to see some details on engagement, because that's the part that's particularly going to be difficult to do now during a pandemic. I mean, we have some outlets, but we have to just get this message out there and get that in front of the community so that they're able to absorb and digest it in something a little bit more friendlier than this kind of situation that we have right here.
Agreed. In one of the points, to piggyback off of Steve and Darren, the FAC has been instrumental in helping guide that narrative and in helping get the message out for the community. The FAC used to meet bi-monthly. This year, Darren and Steve and Todd really suggested that we move that up and meet monthly. And instead of moving that group instead of having that group be almost a passive group where they would see presentations after they were done and ask questions, we're really trying to get that group as much information as possible ahead of time so they can offer their expertise and advice and help shape a lot of the narrative and the decision-making process. So really trying to be as proactive as we can with the FAC, because it's a great cross-section of our community, a lot of expertise in the business field, a lot of expertise in the financial field. They've been really, really great over the last couple of months as we've increased their involvement with making recommendations and really having some good conversations.
Todd, just to piggyback on what Greg was talking about, we right now are currently 1 quarter behind. We always get, 3/4 of our money is from the current year, and 1 quarter. And at one point we were they don't pay out in the exact same way they did before, right? I think they changed that a little bit, but we were two full payments behind at one point.
Right.
And so is there any real fear in just sort of some payments not coming this year and we just fall further behind? So we only get 80% of our payments this year, and now next year they start making, but we perpetually never we go back to 100% next year, but we've got payments from the last year.
Right. So, and kind of recap what Darren's talking about is the reimbursement schedule. So the way that school finance works in the state of Illinois, which is not the same else in other states, but in the state of Illinois, the district is reimbursed the following fiscal year for its expenses in special education reimbursements, transportation areas. Which are millions of dollars, those are reimbursed in the next fiscal year. Several years ago, 6, 8, I lose track after a while, the state made only 3 payments in a year instead of 4. So each year we get 4 payments, but one payment is from the previous fiscal year, not the 2 previous, which for transportation right now is helpful, because last year's transportation, because of the 50-day shutdown and no cost or very little cost to the district, that first payment reimbursement that we received in fiscal year 21 is from fiscal year 19, which was a larger reimbursement piece. So it helps our funding. Now, it also helps us level set, next year we'll have a much lower payment. We'll have some, 1 low payment and then 2 better off, depending on what our final number is for this year. I've not seen where that has been delayed. I believe it is my understanding that the current administration's focus has been obviously is salaries, bonds, and to ensure that that schools are receiving those reimbursements on the quarterly basis structure, and that the evidence-based funding model is funded, and that has actually not changed. That has been consistent throughout. I would even say corporate personal property has been more timely currently than it had been previously. Those sometimes lagged by a month or so. So,
But that's just taking money that comes in and moving, kind of like property tax, just through the state.
right, but
This money is part of their big pool of money, and I just worry about that a little bit more.
It used to be a lot, and Todd, jump in if I'm misspeaking. Prior to the evidence-based funding model, it used to be more clearly defined into 4 categorical payments, and you would get your first categorical, your second categorical, your third, your fourth. A lot of the things that were traditionally in those categorical payments are now rolled into the evidence-based funding model.
Right.
That being said, there still are categorical payments because they didn't roll everything into the evidence-based funding model. But you're exactly right. In what I had referenced earlier is not only the missing of those categorical payments, but also proration. Let's not forget it wasn't that long ago where the state said, yeah, we said we're going to give you X amount of dollars, but we really don't have that. So this year you're prorated at 85% or you're prorated at 79%, and we're only going to make 2 categorical payments. So what a lot of districts were doing 4 or 5 years ago is we were just budgeting for 2 categorical payments and picking a proration percentage to see where we're at with that. Now, proration impacts us, but not at the same level it would impact a district with not as big of a tax base as we have. That is where the districts that have trouble raising a lot of funds locally really get hit with proration, because if you get a bigger portion of your income from the state and that gets prorated at 85% versus if you get a smaller piece of revenue and that gets prorated at 85%. But nevertheless, when your margins are as thin as ours are here in 58, any kind of proration, any kind of miscategorical, any kind of flat funding from the state, you're going to feel, because nothing stays flat in terms of our bills, whether that's labor contracts, whether that's utilities, you name it. I've never seen a bill go down in all my years in education. It's rare that happens. And so this is where, though, as we add things on to a school district, you really have to have some good, solid conversations about what's going to come off, because you cannot continue to do it all. And so that's where those difficult conversations come. And that's what the rest of December, January, and February are going to look like. And I agree with Steve. It's not a question of, should this happen? It has to happen. And unfortunately, anything you cut in a school district is going to touch a third rail, right? Or a sacred cow or something like that. We have to make sure that we continue to tell that narrative of community about the value we're providing and what we have to stop doing, because it does get complex, it does get emotional, it does get personal. But again, our goal is to make sure for our staff and for our students, we continue to provide that consistent experience. But as we add on, we've got to take some things off as well.
Thank you.
A couple of questions. The tip that's rolling off about a year from now, the additional $75 million in tax base, how much does that mean in terms of additional revenue for us? Approx?
I'll have to look up. It's a couple million, but it's the equivalent. That amount of money in the TIF I am looking at is almost equivalent to the 2.3% CPI that the district is going to be getting, that has benefited this tax levy. So in many ways, and let me back up 2 steps. As administration, as we looked 2 years ago, 3 years ago at that TIF district, it was a piece that we looked at as okay, we have, some CPI numbers coming in and up at 1.5%, 2% or whatever. That money may be available to use for some capital, some one-off, some updates that need to happen that we haven't done. Put COVID into it in the economy and changing the whole, what that might mean for inflation at the end of December, because it's the change from the previous December 2019 to the change in 2020. So how much did those items go up in the last, in that December to this December? Now we're looking at that TIF as helping us stay whole and not any new money, because the CPI number is looking, at one point it was close to negative. Now it's come back from April to now where it's about a 1.5, 1.3. It always takes a dip from November to December because there is a level of discounting for businesses to clear their shelves before their year end, and that has an impact on that inflation. So it's a couple $1 million. Now the other piece is tax levies, because many districts take that spring money and are able to put it into the future fiscal year. So they accrue it and put, so one tax levy goes in for the entire next fiscal year. We don't have that option. That money, that revenue that comes in the spring is revenue for the current fiscal year. So the levy that the board just approved, that will go through the process. The bills will go out in April or in May and start to be received and be paid in June. And that first half of that money goes into this current fiscal year. The second half goes into the next fiscal year. So we split years. So when that TIF goes off and you levy that 21, half of it's going to be in fiscal year 22, half of it's going to be in fiscal year 23. So it minimizes that true impact because it's split between two fiscal years, but it's still in the neighborhood. That's the long answer of it's about $2.2 million.
Okay.
But I wanted to run through that process to understand to show the impact of levy year to the fiscal year, to know that it's delayed and to know that it is helping the district keep current to covering its obligated expenses, through the projection.
Thanks for that. I appreciate it. The other question I had was on the $850,000 mechanical equipment. Refresh my memory on where that is going.
Some of this can be boilers, electricals. I'm going to have to get a detailed list more from operations. We're looking at boiler replacement pieces. We're working on the number of boiler work that we've had done in the last 2 weeks is substantial. And to understand that, we had at one place, one building, a team in all night and this is not our team, this is a contractor, all night welding to get the heat back up and running on Thursday and Friday. That was one of 4 calls last week for work to be done in different buildings on boilers.
I ask these questions because it's helpful for folks, not only ourselves, but anybody that's listening, and also as we talk about narratives, how much we are tiptoeing close to the edge here. As long as I've been on the board, it's not been very long, we've talked about, I remember pulling Todd aside in 18 maybe, of will we make May payroll? And how much should we be worrying about making May payroll? We worried about that again last year, and we'll worry about it again this year. We all hope that we don't have a second roof that needs to be replaced between now and 2021. And oh, by the way, we're also being able to make this happen because we're borrowing against taxpayers in 2029. Right? The DSED is not paying current projects with current money, it's current projects with future money, 9 years down the road. I mean, there's a philosophy of, we have a current narrative already written for us. Downers Grove is very fiscally responsible, low tax base, and high quality education, safe community. We can continue to like build that narrative, and we still have to cut $1 million out of our budget next year.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't get us to a financially different place. It gets us to a financially
Status quo.
Place. And so I'd love to push ourselves of, are we signing on to a philosophy that is, yes, let's continue to play pretty close to the edge, and we have pride in the fact that we make a dollar go pretty far. Or we want to be a district, and a district for future boards and for future community members that doesn't have this worry every year on whether we'll make May payroll or whether we'll be able to fund the next group. And I know the $200,000 addition to the fund balance helps us guard against some of that, but it helps us guard against one roof, not two, on 15 roofs. It helps us guard against a May payroll, but potentially not a first week of June payroll, or first June payroll if state payments start to become less predictable. And so what this all gets me to is, I think what I'm looking for in January and February and ultimately March is potentially scenarios as opposed to a recommendation. And maybe scenarios and a recommendation. But at minimum, I'd like to see multiple things of what it looks like to become financially responsible plus, and what's it mean to stay status quo, playing pretty close to the edge. Just so we have this is all about trade-offs. As a board, it's all about trade-offs. We can choose to fund program X, or we can choose to fund capital investment Y. And I'd love to be able to know what is it that the administration recommends if we were to be further from the edge. What are the things that it means we cut? And are we as a board going to be able to take a stand on saying we're going to play less close to the edge because it's more fiscally responsible for us to do that, rather than worry about May payroll every year?
And I like that analogy, Crowd, of being near the edge. I would argue you're over the edge as a district.
When you're borrowing against 2029.
Yeah, I'm just going to be.
Against future revenue.
So I think this district, with all due respect, was close to the edge in 2007 at the last operating fund referendum that did not pass. And that was 13 years ago. And you're still seeing, I think you've been on that edge ever since. I'm amazed at all the boards and all the people who came before us at how they walk that edge. They've done an amazing job. I've never seen a district be that good at that. But one of the things that concerns me as the superintendent is, when you look at other districts around us, some of the things that other districts take for granted, we're not even able to entertain as a conversation at this particular point. I'll give you one example that I hear all of the time: full day kindergarten, right? Full day kindergarten in 2020 is a really great example of when you look at a suburban school district like Downers Grove, most people are not having, or most districts are not having a conversation about whether or not that's an optional thing. It is a thing in most school districts. And so we've talked about this, or started to scratch the surface about this at the FAC in terms of two different funding options. Not only a building bond initiative to, fix the capital, but also another question in terms of your education fund, your operating funds, to get away from that edge. And so you can start having conversations about things like full day kindergarten. And there's many other examples there. There's one that I highlighted. So I agree with you. I would make the argument, though, you're past the edge right now in our district, and we're doing all these things to really hang on. And how long you can sustain that is you're getting about as close as you can.
I'm just looking at this budget timeframe for 2022, and it talks about January, February, March, kind of giving us various different drafts and bringing more information to us. is that speaking mostly in reference just to 2022, or we're talking about bringing us more information, drafts of this whole 5-year plan? Like people have mentioned maybe we have to cut $1 million from the budget for next year. We have to find reductions of $1 million for 2022. Is that when we're going to get more specifics about what exactly that's going to look like? What are those reductions? What are you recommending as reductions? Or as well as looking forward into 23, 24, 25, et cetera?
I think you're going to see both. And let me explain why December, January, February are so important. In terms of staffing decisions, in what you have to have those by 45 days to the end of the school year. So those are going to come up. Now, when I say this, I know when our employees hear this, they're going, oh my gosh, what does that mean? Please know that this is an organic process that we start with our administration. We talk with our associations. We really have some good conversations before we get there. And just because you cut a position doesn't necessarily mean you cut a person, right? Because you can redeploy them. You can do all sorts of different things. So I just want to be clear on that. So part of what that process is you start that process because decisions that you make for FY22, if you make that decision to cut something, then you don't have that in 23, you don't have that in 24, you don't have that in 25. So it does start to span out. However, though, there are other things that will continue the dialogue well past April. And those are things like technology. So an example is, do we need to buy all the servers ourselves, or should we be virtualizing those and outsourcing some of those on the cloud? So those are conversations that will continue to happen. But what our goal is to have that 5-year plan to you at that particular time in the spring so that we can start making these decisions, and then they will impact each year's budget. The thing about a 5-year plan is it's really good, and Todd, you jump in here because we talk about this all the time. It's a great thing, but it can also be a limiting thing. And we want to be upfront with the Board of Education about that, because once you commit to that, there's not a lot of wiggle room, down the road in terms of new things that may pop up. Did that answer your question, Emily?
Yes.
But I guess just to kind of clarify Karat's question, right? So, you guys are going to go back and kind of create various scenarios and a recommendation coming out of the administration, right? Is that what we're going to see? Here's 3 or 4 different scenarios that we looked at, short term for FY22. Here's our recommendation because of X, Y, Z, and then. So is that going to kind of be the format that we're going to see?
Yeah, I think this dialogue certainly helps us, and it helps us not only with our planning, but it helps us with the FAC planning, because there are multiple different scenarios you can take a look at, right? You can take a look at just what if we didn't do anything but just fix the DSEP, right? That could be scenario 1. Scenario 2 is, well, what if we fix the DSEP and go after an operating fund and a building fund? Scenario 3 could be, so this conversation helps Todd and I then go back to bring different scenarios and options to the FAC. I think what we're really looking for as an administration is to use that FAC as a vehicle to help us with a recommendation as well, so that we can give the board, hey, we looked at this, we looked at this, we looked at this, and here's where we think your best avenue is at this particular time. But yes, Steve, I do see that evolving into that.
Okay, thanks for clarifying this. I had the same question.
Just to make sure I understand, when you describe the scenarios that way, what I'm not hearing, maybe I misheard.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not hearing us get to our goals, right? If we just configure the DSEB, that doesn't get us to 35% of fund balance and $200,000 back into capital funds, does it?
No. So I didn't address the goals, but in any of these situations, we would only present to you options that got us to that balanced budget, hitting the fund balance policy. And then the next question becomes, how far beyond do we want to go with that? And so, yes, I certainly do believe that is exactly what we presented to you.
Okay, so I guess just to be super specific, what I would be looking for, and I'm happy to hear other board members and their position on this. What I'd like to hear are scenarios. I'll just put it out there, maybe 3 scenarios. One scenario that gets us to the $200,000 fund balance addition on top of the 35% of the fund balance. So an additional 200,000 that gets us to the capital goal. A second scenario that gets us further than that gets us to $400,000, because playing so close to the edge feels irresponsible, and I'd like to be even more responsible. And a scenario that's less responsible, right? That gets us to no additional capital funding, and we're putting $0 against it. I'm happy to play with the numbers there, but what I mean to say is those are actual trade-offs. We can be more financially responsible and have less programming or other capital investments, or we can be potentially less financially responsible, but get what we want today. And I think us having those conversations and those conversations in public, I think are what people need to be able to see to know what trade-offs we have to be able to make. And I'd love for the public to come out to Greg's point and say, I can't believe you're putting X on the chopping block. But when a public comes out to say, I can't believe you're putting X on the chopping block, I want them to be able to present to us, why not put Y? Or why not suggest something else to trade off against? As we start talking about trade-offs, you start to build a narrative around what are you trading off against versus saying, don't touch my iPad or don't touch my classroom or don't touch X. It doesn't make it so that you're trading off against something else. And so I'd like for us to put scenarios out, because it's the debate we have to have every month anyway when we're talking about budgeting and finance. And as you as an administration have to do that at every payroll, what are we willing to give up this month because we can or cannot make payroll? I think the community needs to see that.
Well, and I think to that point, I think this board in particular everyone would agree that, like Steve said, this is not should we do these things? We must do these things. And I think we all agree with that there has to be some changes that are made in the next several years and moving forward to keep the district financially fit, so to speak. And I think, like Karat was saying, having options and scenarios to present to the community to explain, we have to make changes somewhere. Should we make A change, B change, C change, D change, et cetera, and get feedback from them as well, I think is helpful in the whole idea of getting everyone, quote unquote, on board or behind the changes that are going to be made, because potentially they could be difficult changes. Potentially they could be, there could be disagreement. Like, people have their priorities and the things that they value as part of District 58. And I think presenting those options and putting scenarios open and on the table and discussing them publicly for the community to see is important. And I think getting feedback from them as well is important.
And the other thing I would suggest to the board as you go through this, I would caution you, because Emily, you're exactly right. And I've been through this in my previous district in 181 when we were in a very, very similar situation. The one thing I would just prepare the board for, and I'm sure all of you know this, is once you start to put those different trade-offs on there, there are many things that are important to many people, and this is where the tough decisions have to get made. So that is certainly something there. The other thing too, though, that I would always encourage all of us to do is, in Karat, this is why I appreciate what you were talking about, is if we're not so close to the edge, we can talk about what that investment means and what other things we could offer people. And I think that's very, very important. I think people are always willing to take some trade-offs if they know that there's going to be a benefit on the other end of that. And so how do you, if we were to be able to cut X, Y, and Z over here, we might be able to do A, B, and C over here. I think those are very important conversations to have. And I think myself included, only being here 18 months, but many of you have heard a lot of those things that our community really wants. And again, I'll just keep using that example of full day kindergarten, but that is an example of something that I think is universally really liked in our community, but we're not able to offer at this particular time.
There's two things I want to say real quick. And one of them is there's a lot of levers we can pull and move to try to make some changes. Fewer than we'd like, but there are several. But in the short term, there's very few levers on the revenue side, right? I mean, we can have larger conversations about referendums or what are those, but I mean, that takes time. It takes building a narrative. It takes understanding our community. It takes deciding whether that's one on the DSUB, whether that's one on operational, or whether that's a capital one. Capital ones usually are the ones that are the easier ones to talk to your community about. But those will be very, very hard conversations, and there's no guarantee that that goes anywhere. We know that from 2007. So I think that I just want to reiterate that because I feel like some of the things when we're talking about scenarios, I think right now, more than not, that's probably going to look more like trimming things up as opposed to finding additional. I mean, there's some small ones we can do some fees. There might be some property things that we can do, but that still won't be super fast. I mean, fees would be the quickest thing that we can do being the next school year. And in the grand scheme of things, when you're talking about a $72 million budget, it's not as much as you would like. The second thing I want to clarify a little bit, because maybe I'm out of sync with the rest of the board, and that is I want to be careful about building too many scenarios and turning this into a public debate where we're pitting one service against another service. What I'd really be looking for from Kevin and his entire team is a analysis of what we're doing in this district and how we can shore up some cuts that has the lowest impact on the majority of our families. And none of them are going to be exciting. I mean, we remember a couple of years ago when there was some shift and changes in our librarians in this district. And that was very, very upsetting. Whatever it is that happens here, it's going to have a impact on some folks here in our district emotionally, because it's something that is very important either for their child or for them personally or something that they do, or it's going to affect could affect somebody's job or not. Like we said, or just is the role that they wanted to do. And now, now they have to shift the direction that they're in. So I think what I would be looking for personally is some real solid recommendations on what would be the best impact on our district and what kind of tees us up for that next year. Because we were right on that edge, and then COVID happened, and it really did. It threw us on the other side of it. We knew we were running close. That's why we were talking about this fund balance policy. We've been trying to do this in a methodical way to have the least amount of impact on our families and on our staff and everybody else. But what are we, $1.8 million short?
Yeah.
This year?
Yeah.
1.8. I mean,
6.8, yeah.
I mean, that's a gut punch that had that not happened to us, we might have had a little bit more wiggle time to get our stuff in order, but we don't. This is it's sort of been dealt to us now, like figure it out now. Where you're talking about going is exactly where we need to be. I'd love to see a timeline of what that looks like. I can't see a way that we get there in fiscal year 2023, but when we draw those 5-year plans, what does that mean? And if this type of referendum can't pass, what other kind of option do we have? We have to have a plan A, a plan B, and a plan C, I think ultimately out there. So, but I don't know from a recommendation from the administration if anyone feels differently. But
No, I guess you guys are trying to tell me to shut up, and that's fine, but I'm going to try and bridge.
All right, that's enough, Steve.
Yeah, okay. I'll continue on anyways, but I think I'm going to try and bridge what you're saying with what Karat is saying is, I think, I'm not going to speak yet, but I think we all expect Kevin and his team to come forward with a solid recommendation. But I think to kind of say we don't want to put too many scenarios, I think you're looking for, hey, we looked at various scenarios to come up with this recommendation, and that's why we're providing it. So I think what you're saying and what you're saying is how I'm seeing the world. Would you guys agree with that? Or
I'm behind what and that's why I put it out there, is because ultimately we'll come to a better answer as a team than we will as an individual proposal. I do think that we do need to be explicit with the community on what was being traded off against. And we aren't looking for, here's scenario A, B, and C, board, go figure it out. Right. We are looking for a recommendation. Or at least I'm looking for a recommendation. But I do think that we need to be explicit on, here's the things that we traded off against. Here's the things that we didn't want to do, so we did this instead. What I think that means is, instead of doing a lot of that in the back room, you bring that back room to the forefront, and the community sees how close we are playing with fire, or close to the edge we are, whatever the analogy is. And And if we don't share that, and we just show the recommendation, which I knew you wouldn't do anyway, but I want to be explicit that it's important for the folks that are listening and that come to our meetings and that see the notes. What is it that we have to trade off against? None of it's fun stuff to trade off against. And ultimately, a recommendation is what we'll be looking for. But I do think we need to be transparent.
I'd like to piggyback on something you just said in terms of the narrative and I don't know if it's a fine line, but Ty mentioned it earlier with the welders that worked overnight too. I feel like our community probably, they might hear us talk about like dancing along the edges of, you know, going check to check in May. But when they hear about the things that come up like last week and the emergency things that are happening, and like, I forget which school has the 60-year-old boiler, you know.
Most of them do.
Yeah. Like, but to hear the stories of the things where you get the call and you're like, oh crap, we gotta go take care of this emergency. I don't know that everyone really understands that those things all happen, and kids go to school and it's seamless and they have no idea of the things that we have to take care of. I liken it to like in my, you know, my husband and I bought lawn furniture, patio furniture, because we didn't need it, but we wanted it and whatever. And then all of a sudden our water heater went out like the next week. And we're like, crap, we didn't really need that lawn furniture. We really need a water heater. So I just, in terms of like communicating those things, I know it's not sexy or whatever, but, and you don't want to like totally talk about all the things that are failing in the buildings, but I kind of feel like we do have to a little bit to explain to people just the situation that we're in and the cuts that we have to make because we have to take care of those oh crap moments. Let's just piggybacking on what Krat said.
I think Kevin Bardo needs his own Twitter feed.
Yeah.
Anything else?
Thanks, Todd.
Thank you. We look forward to seeing this.
Do we?
We do. It's going to be hard.
Speak for yourself.
No, but we got a roadmap of how we're gonna establish the plan, so we follow the roadmap.
I do have to ask you, only because the time frame to get things moving, the borrowing piece as to where the board is at with that, because if that is something that you wish to move forward on, we'd like to start those
You're talking about restructuring the D7?
restructuring the D7 and so forth. Borrowing these days is a little more complicated than it used to be, just more paper. And so that's something that not that we're looking for an approval, but if that's something that the board is interested in looking at, we can start to move and looking forward.
Yeah, I don't
pull that.
Yeah, I think we can start moving in that direction. I don't think there's a opposition to doing that in the short term.
It also
It's recognized as a short-term fix.
It also helps in understand that that is not something that would be in our operating piece that we would talk about as one of those other options of paying out of.
So when would you be your timeline to bring that back to us? Is that a January thing or would it be February?
We will start working on that with underwriters and so forth, and but they will always tell you that interest rate risk going is that you go as quick as you can if there's a good market, because you take the risk of losing that opportunity. So
This feels more like the floor than anything else. So yeah, I would encourage us to move quickly.
Thank you.
I think in our planning, again, not asking you to vote tonight, but to be able to come back to you at the January meeting with some options and ask for approval. I think that is something we'd be very interested in. If for some reason we couldn't make it by that January meeting, to ask for another special meeting sometime during January, assuming we could work with the underwriters and get everything moving that fast. Would you agree, Don?
Yeah, I was thinking of a parameters resolution and moving approval, but yeah, in January.
I know this is just a high level of effort. So I mean, I guess just Mr. Upple, is there any objection to having him come forward with this? Perfect.
All right. Thank you.
All right, that takes us on to public comment. The board has allotted 30 minutes for an extended opportunity for the board and community communications. At this time, we will play any public comments that have been submitted remotely. Are we still at none? Okay. Then I do have a couple of announcements, really just one. We will be having a board meeting on December 14th at 7 p.m. It's our regular board meeting, that's next Monday at Village Hall. The same rules are going to be applying next week, so it will be live streamed, but it will be live streamed on the Village Hall's YouTube channel.
And just to be clear, there's no in-person attendance next?
No in-person attendance at all next week, but we will be, we'll still be at Village Hall.
Yep.
All right, the board will now meet in closed session. Is there a motion to move to closed session to discuss the appointment, employment, compensation, discipline, performance, or dismissal of specific employees of the District 5 ILCS 122C1?
So moved.
Second.
Is there any discussion? All right, Melissa, please call roll.
Member Doshi.
Aye.
Member Hannah.
Aye.
Member Harris.
Aye.
Member Olson.
Aye.
Member Weiner.
Aye.
Member Hughes.
Aye. Motion carried. The board will now move into closed session after a short recess. We'll meet up at 9 p.m. The board will not be returning to open session. We will adjourn immediately after closed discussions.